My stepmother found me on the porch of my father's lake house 2 hours after his funeral, still wearing black, still holding a paper plate of food I hadn't touched, and told me, without any preamble at all, that the house wasn't mine anymore and that I should start thinking about how quickly I could clear out my things. My name is Marlowe Higgins, 38 years old, and my father Elliot had owned that lake house outside Traverse City, Michigan, for over 25 years. A modest, weathered place on the water where I'd spent every childhood summer, where my own 2 children had learned to fish off the same dock I'd learned on, where my father had spent his final, difficult months of illness surrounded by the water and the pine trees he'd loved more than almost anywhere else in the world. "No, this is hard timing," my stepmother Yvonne said, standing over me with an expression I could only describe as carefully composed impatience. "But I think it's better to be direct. Your father and I were legally married. The house is part of our shared marital estate now, and I've already spoken with an attorney about the transition. I'd like you and the kids out by the end of the month." I want to be honest about how completely disoriented I felt in that moment, grief and shock colliding into something that made it difficult to even formulate a coherent response. Yvonne and my father had married 6 years earlier, following my mother's death, and while our relationship had never been especially warm, I had genuinely believed, based on conversations with my father over the years, that he had made specific arrangements to ensure the lake house would eventually come to me, a promise he'd made explicitly on more than one occasion during his illness, though I realized, sitting on that porch, that I had no actual documentation of any such arrangement. I didn't argue with Yvonne on the porch. I simply told her I needed time to process everything, packed up my children, and drove the 3 hours home in a haze of grief and rising, uncertain dread about what my father's actual estate planning had or hadn't accomplished before his death. I called my father's longtime attorney, a careful, measured man named Desmond Acaffer, the following week, and what he told me reshaped the entire situation in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Your father came to see me about 8 months ago," Desmond said. "He was quite specific about wanting to ensure the lake house went to you directly, separate from the general marital estate, given some concerns he mentioned about family dynamics after his passing. I want to be honest with you, Marlowe. I'm somewhat surprised Yvonne is asserting a claim to the property at all, given what your father set up." I sat with that information feeling something between relief and confusion, uncertain why Yvonne would confidently claim ownership of a property my father had apparently gone out of his way to specifically protect for me. Desmond explained that my father had established a separate revocable trust 8 months before his death, transferring ownership of the lake house directly into that trust, with me named as the sole beneficiary, a structure specifically designed to keep the property outside the general marital estate that would otherwise pass primarily to Yvonne under Michigan's standard spousal inheritance provisions. "There should be a formal notification letter and trust documentation," Desmond said. "Your father asked me to prepare a complete packet for you, including something personal he wanted delivered alongside the legal paperwork. I have it here in our office safe. I think it's time you came in to see it." I drove back to Traverse City 3 days later, sitting across from Desmond in his small, quiet office, as he retrieved a sealed envelope and a small flash drive from his office safe, both of which, he explained, my father had prepared and left specifically with instructions to deliver only after his death, once the trust had been formally activated. The envelope contained the complete trust documentation, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized 8 months before my father's death, unambiguously establishing my sole ownership of the lake house. But it was the flash drive, containing a video message my father had recorded during one of his final lucid weeks, that I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters considerably more than any of the legal mechanics surrounding it. I watched that video alone, in my car in the law office parking lot, unable to bring myself to wait until I got home. My father, visibly weakened but entirely himself in every way that mattered, spoke directly into the camera with a clarity and warmth that undid me completely. He explained that he loved Yvonne, that their marriage had brought him genuine happiness during difficult years after my mother's death, but that he had watched, with growing concern during his illness, a pattern of Yvonne making comments about the lake house that made him worry. She viewed it primarily as a financial asset, rather than the deeply personal, generational place it had always represented for our family. "Need you to understand something, Marlowe," he said, looking directly into the camera in a way that made it feel, impossibly, like he was looking directly at me. "This isn't about not trusting Yvonne with everything. I've made sure she's provided for extensively in every other part of our estate, more than fairly, more than generously. But this house isn't really about money. It's about your children learning to fish off that same dock you learned on. It's about protecting something that matters in a way balance sheets don't capture. I did this quietly, without telling either of you, because I didn't want to create conflict while I was still here to see it. I'm sorry if that decision causes you any difficulty now that I'm not. I love you both. Please try to remember that, whatever happens next." Want to be honest about how long I sat in that parking lot after the video ended, processing not just the legal clarity it provided, but the specific, deliberate love behind my father's quiet decision to protect something he understood mattered beyond its financial value. I called Yvonne 2 days later, not with anger, though I want to be honest that some anger remained, but with a genuine desire to understand her side of a situation that had clearly caught both of us in ways neither of us had fully anticipated. "I didn't know about any trust," Yvonne said, and I could hear, for the first time since the funeral, something considerably more vulnerable than the composed impatience she'd shown on the porch. "Elliot never told me. I assumed the house would simply be part of everything else, and I'll be honest, Marlowe, I've been terrified about finances since his diagnosis, about how I'm going to manage everything on my own now. I think I reacted to that fear more than anything else. And I'm sorry for how I handled that conversation with you, especially that day of all days. I want to be careful here, because I don't think this story is really about villainizing Yvonne, once I understood more fully what she'd actually been navigating. My father's estate planning, generous as Desmond confirmed it to be, still represented a significant transition for a woman facing an uncertain financial future without the partner she'd built her later years around. Her fear was real, even if the way she'd expressed it on that porch had been genuinely hurtful. We met in person 3 weeks later, at the lake house itself, an emotionally complicated visit that I want to describe honestly rather than as some simple, tidy reconciliation. We didn't resolve every complicated feeling between us in a single conversation. But we did agree, sitting together on the same porch where she'd once told me to start packing, that the house would remain exactly what my father had intended it to be. A place for our family, complicated and blended and imperfect as it was, rather than a battleground either of us wanted to keep fighting over. I invited Yvonne to spend a week at the lake house that following summer, alongside my children, an invitation she accepted with a gratitude that told me considerably more about her actual feelings than her initial reaction at the funeral ever had. I watched her sit on that same dock, watching my children fish, and I understood, watching her quiet, complicated grief alongside my own, that my father's final gift hadn't just been a house. It had been an opportunity for 2 women who loved him, in different ways, for different reasons, to eventually find their way back to something resembling family, once the initial shock and fear had space to settle into something more honest. I still have that flash drive. I watch it every few months, usually on quiet evenings at the lake house once my children are asleep, listening again to my father's voice explaining, with such deliberate care, exactly why he'd protected this particular place so carefully. He was right that it was never really about the money. It was about a dock, and a lake, and generations of a family finding their way back to the water, no matter how complicated the path to get there eventually became.